Welcome back to our second block this morning. Our next speaker is Inês. She's a recorder player, teacher, and researcher, interested primarily in 18th century Italian music. Inês.
Right. Do you see my screen? Do you see the title now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so this should be working. The inspiration for this talk came from Castrucci's Opus 1 violin sonatas published by Jean Roger in Amsterdam in 1718, and later re-edited in a transcription for the recorder by Lecen sometime between 1723 and 1743. Lecen was her brother-in-law and successor in the family printing business. In the first print, a great variety of symbols can be found, and studying those and comparing it with the recorder version, I found something puzzling. Here at the top, we see the original print of 1718, and at the bottom, the recorded transcription. At the top, marked in red, are all the instances of a plus in this system, and in blue, all instances of a T. Note how all the plus signs with upper appoggiaturas at the top become T signs without appoggiaturas at the bottom, and how the T signs without appoggiatura at the top become T signs with an appoggiatura on the same note or the lower one at the bottom. Are the plus signs at the top trills starting on the note above and T signs trills starting on the main note? The possibility that the engraver simply over-interpreted the same symbol cannot be ruled out, of course, as a handwritten T and a plus can very easily be mixed. But taking into account the level of detail necessary to create this, I thought it was worth entertaining the possibility that these signs stood for different kinds of trills, so I went looking. Before asking how and later on when to play a trill, I'll start with asking what is a trill. A trill is a trembling or a shaking, and this definition leaves a lot of room to interpretation, and as we will see, what kind of trembling or shaking and how one should tremble or shake is not always clear, neither is it as uniform as our current performance practice may lead us to believe. To give it some historical context, here we see three different types of trillo, or in the case of Di Rutta, tremolo, in publications of the 1590s, 1600s, and the 1620s in Florence, Rome, and Venice. This open definition of trembling or shaking easily explains these various guises and interpretations, both in terminology and in how it is notated. On to the period we are concerned with today. When writing about the 8 kinds of trills that he identifies, Tosi, Bologna, 1723, starts by defining the trillo maggiore as one which beats between a note and a note above violently, or if I'm less literal, energetically. All other trills, he says, derive from this one. So in his most basic definition of a trill, Tosi doesn't tell us on what note the trill must start, unlike many of his later followers. Whether we view this as relevant or not is of course up to our interpretation. Later on, Tosi does write that a beautiful trill wants to be prepared, although the preparazione, he writes, is not always necessary, either because there's no time or because taste doesn't require it. He also says that it is necessary to prepare a trill, however, on all final cadences and in several other places, at times with the tone above, at other times with the half tone above, depending on the key of the composition. Note, however, that what Tosi doesn't tell us is that the trillo maggiore or minore or the mezzo trillo or any of the other types of trills must always begin on the note or note above. Tosi is not alone in leaving out on what note a trill must start when defining what it is. In these anonymous regole dated 1714, we simply read that a trill consists sometimes of a tone, other times of a semitone above. In the example above here, after showing us the symbol or abbreviation used for a trill, which I call squiggly line, this anonymous author writes that the note above which this symbol is found should be played united or less literally translated slurred to another note above it. Though already outside of our time frame for the seminar, in the example at the bottom, Lorenzoni still gives us this basic definition of the trill being the alternation of a note with a note above it. Judging by the context in which Lorenzoni is inserted and the authors he cites, we may deduce he trilled from the note above, but he himself does not write that when defining what a trill is, neither does an explanation for the execution of a trill appear in the examples. So interestingly, it seems that it's not as important to tell us on what note a trill starts than it is to tell us that one trills with a note above the written one. This is interesting because the trill starting on the note above has become the paramount common denominator of the performance practice of a wide range of Baroque repertoires, and not only within early music specialisms. In its most simple meaning, when it isn't a repetition of vibration of the same note, a trill is the alternation between the written note and the tone or semitone above it, sometimes quickly, sometimes accelerating, sometimes starting on the note above, sometimes not. Let's have a look at examples of trills starting on the note above, organized chronologically. Here, Lorenzo Penna, Bologna, 1679, we see trills of a somewhat hybrid type, as we see the small repetition of the notes as Caccini would at the top staff, notated with a T and clearly starting with the upper note. Here we see an example from an anonymous Italian translation of Corret's method published in Paris in 1740. Although at times this translation does take some liberties in interpreting the French text, there seems to be no need to caution us to the existence of other types of trills in Venice at that time. Geminiani, London, 1749, shows us two types of trills, and I'm leaving out what he calls the close shake. He shows us a trill with termination and one without, both of which begin on the upper note. Note that the two examples in the lower right corner, taken from the same movement in his opus 8, show in essence the same thing, notated by different means. Either a sign of imprecision or of extreme precision, if the termination indicated by the yellow arrow on the left is to be played slower than the one indicated by the pink arrow on the right. Or perhaps a sign that there is more nuance meant by these symbols, even when we have the author's explanations. Tartini is by far the most detailed in his discussion of trills. In this source, which survives in a few copies dated from before the publication in French in Paris, Tartini gives us examples of the execution of trills which clearly start on the upper note. Interesting to me is the example at the bottom. We read that the trill can begin in several ways, as exemplified at the top, or prepared from above or from below. From above with a sustained appoggiatura, which is not added in the other examples and therefore seems to be a true appoggiatura, and from below, and I quote, with notes that resemble the beginning of a trill. Note, however, that these notes resemble the beginning of a trill starting on the main note. Going beyond the time we are concerned with, again, Mancini, Vienna, 1774, refers to Tosi when writing about trills, but adds the information that it should start with the nota falsa and end with the nota vera. Lastly, although far outside our period, Galeazzi, Rome, 1791, writes that a mezzo trillo is a very quick trill that always starts with the upper appoggiatura ending on the main note. A trillo must start on the lower appoggiatura and end with a turn or termination. And the trillo imperfetto doesn't have the lower appoggiatura at the start, but still has a turn at the end. Galeazzi writes that the trillo imperfetto often happens when the note of the trill is preceded by its upper neighbor. He seems to mix, however, the upper note with the appoggiatura, although these are in fact, of course, very different things. Interesting to note are the symbols that represent each of his trills, and the fact that the written appoggiaturas don't seem to mean anything in the examples. If he writes the mezzo trillo always starts with the upper note, notating the upper appoggiatura is unnecessary unless the note should be held, and that is not what the examples show. Now, does this only apply to Galeazzi's time and context, or do we need to revise our reading of all these appoggiaturas before notes with a trill, also in earlier repertoire? And if so, what kind of trill should be played on notes without a notated appoggiatura? Let's now have a look at trills starting on the main note, also organized chronologically, and I'm glad that we are online because then you cannot egg me. The author of these anonymous regole, probably from the 1670s, writes that the trill ends on the same note on which it starts, or in other words, it starts on the note, not the note above. We read further that this is the case without any exception for both hands, although one of the notated examples seems to contradict that. This is the example given in order to practice a trill in Bismantova's Regole per il canto figurato of his Compendio Musicale, written in Ferrara between 1677 and 1679 and revised at the end of the 17th century. This is an interesting source which exists in at least 4 copies. In the one at the bottom, we see an indication to trill on the last note without instructions on which fingers to use. On the copy at the top, however, we are instructed to trill using 3-4 or 2-3, translated in symbols into modern fingering. If a start with the upper note was intended, it would have been just as easy to have written 4-3 and 3-2. This is of course not definitive evidence, but suggests that an interesting line of inquiry might be found in indications of fingerings going back as early as the ruta. The same is seen here. A squiggly line indicates the trill, and above it 3-4 for the fingers that should trill. Again, it could just as easily have been written 4-3. Another inconclusive but highly suggestive piece of evidence is this Toccata by Scarlatti, which shows us basically what we saw with Tartini, except now we don't have words or examples by Scarlatti to indicate whether this written out proto-trill, indicated by the arrows in yellow, will continue on, probably accelerating without adding the upper note at the start of the long notes. In his letter to his pupil Maddalena Lombardini, Tartini instructs her to practice the trill as shown in this example. Although this may be simply a technical instruction for the easiest way to do it on the violin, he does not warn her to practice this way, but always start the trill with the note above it when performing. Also here, extrapolating to a later example, Manfredini, Venice, 1775, writes the already familiar definition of the trill as the alternation of a note with a tone or semitone above, and adds that it should be done as quickly as possible. In the examples, contrary to what we saw in Mancini only 1 year later, Manfredini shows us trills starting on the note. We have already seen the symbols used for the simplified notation of trills, T, TR, and a variety of squiggly lines, and of course the plus that we saw at the beginning with Castrucci, followed or not by dots. You may have noticed that these are representative of a variety of executions, and by now have realized that they cannot be easily interpreted without a context. Let's consider further what this diversity of symbols and possibilities for their execution entails. Take this example in which the same copyist uses in different pieces in the same collection both a squiggly line and a T or TR. Are these the same, or do they represent different types of trills or ornaments? Same here. Are the squiggly line and the TR meant to represent the same musical outcome? In the case of copyists, one may argue that the diversity of symbols in a collection of works by different composers may reflect the diversity of symbols used in the sources copied. However, in this case, we are looking at an autograph. Did Carcani use different symbols for the same ornament as one of the possible interpretations of what we saw in Geminiani's Opus 8, or are these representative of different ornaments? And in this case, do we need to ask the same question in other instances? Before quickly moving on to the placement of trills where none are notated, I also wanted to show these 2 copies of the same work by Durante. Note how we are back with the conundrum of what is a trill, trembling or shaking. Above, something that may be interpreted as a kind of vibrato. Below, staccatos followed by trills. About where to add trills outside of cadences, Tosi points out that in the cadenza superiore, where one has mi, re, do, for example, the trill should be prepared, which could mean that otherwise it might not. He also notes that nowadays, those who consider themselves modern leave out trills in the cadenza inferiore, where one has do, si, do, for example. Tartini writes that any cadence requires a trill. It is true, however, he says, that perfect cadences need a certain kind of trill and that other cadences need another. Perfect cadences should have a trill, as we saw before, but in any other cadence, the trill should include a termination. When there is enough time, a passing appoggiatura should be added to these termination notes, as shown here at the bottom. And I will go quickly so that I don't extrapolate my time. From the same source that we had seen before for the basic definition of the trill, we now learn that when a bass line moves in stepwise descending motion in groups of 4/8 or 4/16 notes, a trill should be added on every 3rd note of the group. This is a source that corroborates this, and this is another one, both not only in the bass. However, in the case of quarter notes, trills should be added on the 1st and 3rd notes. In ascending motion, we learn that the trill is placed on the 4th note when it is a semitone, And there are, of course, many more examples, but we don't have time for them all. I hope to have been able to show, if anything, that variety, diversity, and controversy seem to be intrinsic to the discussion, and probably not only in the case of trills. Uniformity and the quest for prescriptive formulas doesn't necessarily reflect this period's performance practice, but much more our own. Thank you.